The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, good morning, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and if y'all could drop a Y or a yes into the questions pane just like normal, let me know I'm coming through loud and clear here. And then we'll get started. Okay, great. Awesome. So thanks so much for joining us, guys. My name is Emma with Exago BI. I'm super happy to have you guys here today. So this month is a little bit different as far as the labs are concerned. We are going to be doing two technical topics, so two admin-focused labs. I believe the blast did indicate that, but I just wanted to reiterate to make sure that everyone who was attending today was aware that though the first lab of the month is generally speaking an end-user topic, we're actually going to be working in a little bit of code today. Nothing too crazy, but code nonetheless. So I just wanted to make sure that right off the bat, we're all aware this is an admin-focused lab. Great. So that being said, let's jump right in. Today's lab is about a dynamic rank custom function. So we're actually going to start with a custom function that you might already be familiar with. It's called dynamic logo or my logo. We've touched on it in a previous lab that had a focus on custom functions. It's used, generally speaking, to dynamically select a logo from the file system and display it based on the user that is authenticated into the host application, right, in an embedded environment. And of course, pass that user information or company information to Exago to select a logo to display on a report. Now, this means that we can create one report and swap that logo dynamically again, so we don't need to have multiple iterations of a single report. Now, following that, and that's going to be a bit of a refresher, following that, we're going to look at a modification of that function that dynamically generates a star image. If you can imagine a rating site like G2 Crowd, they have ranks or ratings. And we're going to talk about how to use the dynamic logo function, change the code a little bit to show one of those star rankings based on an input value between 0 and 5. Now, this is a user input value. They can give decimal values. We're going to do the rounding for them. All of this will become very clear when we get into the code. So I'll go ahead and go to the next slide here. The overview is exactly what I just talked through. We're going to look at the logo function on the output. Then we're going to look at the code. Same thing with the dynamic rank function. We'll look at the output, and then we'll take a look at the code itself. This means that the format of the lab itself is pretty straightforward today, but we are going to talk about the differences between the code and how you'll use them on the front end as well. So it should be pretty cool, pretty quick, easy to follow today. Now, a few of the highlight topics. We're going to look at the key differences since you guys should be or might be slightly familiar with the first. I'm going to focus on what we've changed and why it's important on the second. Invalid input considerations, I mentioned, but I'd like to explicitly say at this point, in the second function, the user is giving us that input value. So there's a few more considerations we need to keep in mind in terms of error checking, as well as presenting them an error message that might indicate to them what to change in order to better utilize the function. To that end, we'll talk about the benefits of storing that message in a language file as opposed to specifying it right in the code. Finally, I will end with a practical use case, a report that might lend itself to get your wheels turning. You know, how might I use this in my own environment? I have practical in quotes because I am kind of tricking some Northwind data fields here to give us what we'd like, but on the output, again, it is a practical application. Now, just to reiterate before we jump in, the next lab is also an admin lab. Travis is actually going to be walking us through some configuration options that we are going to be giving you guys in version 2019.1. That lab will be on the 24th. Again, it is another technical lab, so feel free to tune back in if you're interested in these. And just for housekeeping purposes, all of the labs are recorded. We're recording the session right now today. It will be hosted both on YouTube and our support site following the lab in just a few hours afterwards. And we'll have links, reference information, as well as any code that I do show today. All right, so we're going to get started. Any questions throughout, please feel free to type into the questions pane. I've got a few coworkers with me today to monitor those questions, and we'll be sure to answer whatever we can while we're on the lab today, and of course follow up on anything else. Great. So we're going to go ahead and start with a refresher of the dynamic logo function. On the front end, I'm going to go ahead and navigate to my report. Let's take a look at the design of this report. I can actually zoom in just a little here, make it a little bigger for you guys. Few things on this report. The actual data down here is not important today. We're going to be focusing on the page header content. Now, one thing to just clarify right off the bat, the use that I'm about to show you is not the way you guys will use this dynamic logo function very likely. Generally speaking, the company ID parameter is a value that is set via the API. Being that in production, you'll be in an embedded environment, Exago will be within a host application. The host application will handle the authentication of whatever user is trying to log in, and will then pass identifying information to Exago via our .NET API or our REST web service, one of which, or a component of which, might be the company ID parameter. That is the information that the dynamic logo function then looks to utilize to understand what logo to display, again, for the user that is authenticated into the host app. Now, since today I'm showing you on my local copy and we're not embedded, we're going to take the API out of the equation. I'm just going to swap the parameter value for the company ID. On the report level, I've got it prompting. I just flipped the flag on the parameter to unhidden, and we can go ahead and very quickly show the differences here. The other thing to pay attention to is in the top left here is where the actual logo image will display. Right? You'll note that there is no user input. This function takes no arguments. Running the report, we get that prompt just like I said. We're going to see a default value of Exago, so I will press OK. We see the Exago logo, as well as the company ID filled in that title formula right over here. Great. I'm going to rerun the report, and this time I'm going to change this value. Let's plug in Jeff Tech. Now, this is a fictitious company that we reference internally. If any of you have had the pleasure of working with Jeff Kalpakis over here at Exago, you know we'd all be proud to work for him. We often reference this internally, so it's a little joke there, but you'll see the logo for Jeff Tech populate in the upper left here in place of that Exago logo. As well, we can see the string Jeff Tech replaced as the company ID parameter in the title. Okay, so pretty simple there. Briefly, I'd like to walk through the code behind that custom function. Again, even if only to be able to then highlight the changes that we made to it to account for the dynamic rank function that we're going to look at in just a moment. Come over to my admin console. And I'm going to go ahead and open up the dynamic logo function. Okay, so a few things to mention. There's an article on the support site that does walk through this function's purpose, use. It has the code there. Additionally, the code is very nicely commented. There's actually more comments than code in this particular example. So you should be able to quite literally read through it top to bottom. For today's benefit, I'm just going to talk us through what's happening here. You'll notice we have one namespace We'll use that same namespace in the subsequent function in just a moment. Additionally, there are no user arguments. We don't actually ask the user for any information here. Again, because it is API driven, we're going to be grabbing the only argument that we need from the session info. So the user doesn't need to be aware of that. And that's where we start here in the code. We're going to grab the company ID that was set at the session level. So we're just going to check out the session info there. We'll set it as a variable here of type string. Moving right along, we're going to build the file name on line 6. So again, this variable logo path is going to hold the name of that logo. We need to be able to differentiate between the images that we'd like to display. So the naming convention is important here. You'll see this in the next function as well. It's very important to name the images that we'd like to display in a way that the function will be able to find them. In this case, we're using the company ID value here, which of course we know will be the value of the company ID parameter itself. We're prefixing each image with logo underscore. They also have a PNG extension here. I just like to mention that since the code is looking for PNG, it's building that file name with a .png extension at the end. Something that you may not consider in setting this up is that your images do need to also have that same extension. Just to mitigate the amount of trial and error that you guys might have to do, I like to mention these things even though they might be a little bit obvious to some of us. All right. So at this point, again, moving right along, we're able to build the full file path that will be used to retrieve the image from the file system. You'll notice that this uses a load image prefix here in front of the logo path, which is the file name that we've just put together on line 6. I'm going to touch back on that in just one moment, so bear with me here. Lines 12 and 15, we first create the embedded formula for the function. Again, the comments are pretty clear, so it should be fairly easy to follow along. And finally, we evaluate the formula for the value and return the resulting image. Okay. Now you may have noticed the load image prefix that I mentioned here, and I do want to take a moment to talk about this. It is important to both functions that we're going to walk through today. In the other settings of your admin console, I'm going to open up mine. There's a load image cell function parameter prefix line. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's C images in my case. You have the ability to specify this. I'm going to go to my file system and just point out exactly what this means. Right on my C drive, I have a folder called images, and this holds all of the images that I'm going to be using in this dynamic nature. So logos are the first ones, right? Which is why I have them labeled logo underscore and then the specific company ID. Additionally, I can store the rest of my images here as well, and these will be used in our dynamic rank function in just a moment. Okay, great. So I'm going to go ahead and take just a moment to make sure there are no questions, but that one is pretty simple. We have walked through it before. I'm sure Nick and Tom are on top of any questions we have gotten, but I'll just take a second in case you are typing, continue to type, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can, of course. All right, great. So let's talk about this dynamic rank function. This is really the new content for today's lab. I'm going to go back to the front end to show you it in action. I always like to start with a look at the functional application of whatever I'm talking about, and then go to the code behind or the design, whatever the case may be. Now in this case, and let me just zoom out just a bit so that you guys can actually see the full scope here. Our function, as I mentioned before, has a scope or bounds of 0 to 5, and it will display images on 0.5 increments. Now this means that if a user inputs a value of, say, 2.1, we'll return an image showing a 2-star rating. If we look at this report, I'm using static values in this case that are going to evaluate to each possible 0.5 increment between 0 and 5. And I'm using decimal values all over the map. Some of them have 1 decimal, some of them have 2 or 3. This one is the value exactly, so we're really running the scope of potential input values here. These are all valid inputs, though. We'll handle the invalid inputs in just a moment. Now, if I run this report, we're going to see all of those images just as we'd expect. I did go in order, so we've got 0 stars, a half a star, 1 star, 1.5, so on and so forth, all the way up to that 5-star rating that we're all usually looking for. One thing I do want to mention here, this function is section agnostic, so we can put it anywhere on our report. You'll notice I have all of these in the report footer, really for no particular reason here. They can live anywhere you want. Now, the thing that we do need to keep in mind if we're using the function in different sections is that if our input value is a data field, as opposed to a static value as it is in my case here, the section might affect which value of that data field is evaluated. Imagine if I put this function in a report header, Exago is going to evaluate the first value of that column of data. A report footer will take the last value, where a detail section might evaluate every single value. So just keep that in mind when you're using the function in different sections with a data field. You might be looking for a certain output, and potentially the section needs to be adjusted in order to get the desired output there. All right, so it's a pretty simple use case. Doesn't take too long to walk through, but I would like to look at the code now, see how this is all coming together, kind of build the parts and pieces, and then again, we'll come back to a bit more practical use case. Certainly, while this is showing you how it's working, this is likely not how you're ever going to use it in application. Let's open up the dynamic rank custom function. We're going to start the same way as before. Now, just like the dynamic logo function, we use the single namespace. In this case, though, I've got one initial very clear difference, and that is that I have an argument. I've titled it rank, make it very obvious, right? This is the actual value, and the description should allow my user to hopefully get it right on the first shot, right? This is what we're looking for. They should be pretty clear on exactly what they need to give this function. Now, just keep in mind, with regards to the argument info and the namespace declaration here, this all might look different if you're writing this in an external assembly. For simplicity's sake, I'm writing it in the admin UI today, and I'm going to walk through it there. Just things to keep in the back of your mind if you do end up taking this code and want to use it in an external assembly, as I know many folks do prefer. So this comment section at the top is going to walk through some of the things I just detailed, the namespace, the argument info. I've tested this in a few versions, so certainly if you do take it and run with it, you should be good to go with those at the very least. This is the start of the custom code, so I'm going to start here and walk through this step by step again. And again, it is commented and very similar to the last one that we just walked through, but let's go ahead and dive in. One thing that we're going to notice is that since we are asking for user input here, there's a bit more error checking that we need to do, as well as error handling. We need to make sure that if we're given an invalid input, as opposed to just erroring in general, we need to give the user a message that might help them to correct their mistake, give them an indication of why we failed, and what they can do to successfully use the function the way that they're probably trying to. All right. Now, the first thing that we're going to do here is create a string variable, and you'll note we use a capital R on that first rank variable. We're actually just setting this the value here as the first argument or the argument in the first position of that args array. Since we only have one argument, we're only asking for one, that is the only argument and will automatically be at the first position, so we can just specify the 0 index of that array there. Ultimately, this variable is only going to be used to pass into this try-parse method here, and since try-parse expects a string, we need to convert it to a string. Likely the input is numeric, hopefully the input is numeric, but we need to force it to a string. It's a variable type as well. We're going to use try-parse to convert it back to a double. So we're doing a bit of converting back and forth here to make sure that that input is in the format that we need for the rest of the function to correctly evaluate. All right, great. So in order to store the output of try-parse in something, we create that double variable as well. And this lowercase rank is what we're going to ultimately use and manipulate in the rest of the function, like I mentioned. Now, in the same line of thinking of ensuring that we indicate to the user what they've done wrong and, of course, check that their input is valid, line 40 checks for a few different things, and I'm going to take them one at a time. This if statement's first condition, and everything is separated by ORs. These double bars indicate an OR relationship. If any of these fail, we will hit that return statement. If any of our conditions are met, we'll hit the return statement. So the first one that we're checking for is that we actually have a numeric value. We're able to convert it to a double. We use try-parse in this case because it returns a Boolean, so a true-false based on success, which allows us to more easily put it right within an if statement and push to that return statement if necessary, as opposed to having to write a bit more code. Though there are other .NET methods that might accomplish the same thing, this was simply the easiest one to use in this case and simplified the code the most. It's the thinking behind the choice there. Certainly there are other ways to do it. You might be asking, couldn't we use other methods there? And the answer is, of course. You're free to change this however you'd like. All right. Now, the last two are arguably more simple. We're just making sure that the numeric value that the user has input is in the bounds, in the scope of the function. Again, we are equipped with the code in front of us to return an image on 0.5 increments for an input value anywhere between 0 and 5, between and including 0 and 5. So if that rank variable ends up being negative or less than 0, or greater than 5, we're not going to know what to do with it. That's not in the scope of the function. So we're checking for those as well. So if necessary, we'll hit this return statement. This is one of the other important pieces I wanted to talk about here because there are other ways to do this as well, but I've selected this method for a particular reason. I could have, and the first iteration of this custom function did actually just specify the return statement as a string right in the code here. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's probably the fastest way to write the method. But storing the return message, the message that I'd like to display to the user in the language file allows for a few different things. First, it's more scalable. If I am deploying in multiple languages, I want to be able to not store different versions of my custom function that return those translated error messages. In this way, I can translate my language file just the way I would be translating all of the other language files associated with Exago, and again, via the API, swapping out the one that is used for the current session. The other benefit to this, and I'm going to go ahead and actually open up my language file here. I've created an external language file, so I'm not storing this right in the files that are deployed or installed when you install Exago by default. Those are going to be overwritten if I update Exago, right? As we update Exago, there's the potential that additional UI elements are added, and we need to then add additional language elements to account for them. So we're going to overwrite the language files every time we reinstall Exago. However, my custom language file will not be overwritten. The installer is not aware that it exists because I created it myself. So this one will not be touched when I update, which is really the best benefit to creating an external, in my case, ENUS extensibility language file. Now in doing so, we need to be aware that we'll then have to tell Exago where to go to get this language element. In the main settings of your admin console, you'll see language files referenced. You simply need to add that additional reference right here. So just make sure those steps are accounted for and we're good to go. On to line 46. Functionality is the same. We're going to be building the file name that will actually be used when we do go look for the image on the file system. But in this case, we're doing a little bit of manipulation as opposed to just populating the company ID parameter in this middle section of the concatenation here. We take the double rank variable. We're going to multiply it by 2 and then round it using the .NET round method. Then we're going to divide it by 2. This will ensure that we always get a 0.5 increment as opposed to rounding it to the nearest integer or some other built-in round method here. We've just tricked it a little bit to ensure that we get the value that we want. The rest of this is exactly the same. We're prefacing each rank image name here with rank underscore, and .png is going to be that extension as well. Now we're using the same load image prefix here. So you might have noticed when I showed this folder before, all of my images are in the same folder. So the logo underscore and rank underscore allows me to ensure that I know which ones are for which custom functions. We can use these together. I'm going to show you a report that does use both. Now at this point, these two steps are exactly the same as the last custom function that we just walked through. We create that embedded formula for the load image function and evaluate it and based on the value and ultimately return the result, the resulting image. All right, so I'm going to go ahead back to the front end. We're going to take a look at invalid inputs. We're going to see the error message that we specified in the language file appear on the front end. And then, of course, we'll bring it together with a more robust practical example. So let's walk through two potential invalid inputs here. The first being a numeric value that's simply out of the bounds. Let's say 11, right? It's far outside the bounds of our function. And if I run this report now, we're going to see the text that we entered in that language file. The value you have entered is not a valid input. Please enter a numeric value that is greater than or equal to 0 and less than or equal to 5. I mentioned a couple times that part of the responsibility in returning a message to the user is making sure that it gives them an indication of what they should be changing here in order to successfully use the function. To that end, since there are a few criteria that need to be met here, potentially in your own implementation, you split the error messages into two based on what the user incorrectly did. Now, in this case, I just input a value that was just out of the bounds. So maybe all I wanted to see there was this second half of, the second half of this sentence. Specify that it needs to be between 0 and 5. If they enter a non-numeric value, let's go ahead and do maybe a string value here. Maybe I'd like to return a different error message that specifies please enter a numeric value and doesn't mention the bounds of the function. Now, in order to do so, you would need to change the code a little bit. You would have an if-else if so that we could hit two separate return statements, and you would probably have two separate language elements in your language file. You're free to do so. For today's purposes, we kept this very simple, but certainly I just wanted to mention that that's an option for you guys as well. All right. Now, finally, that practical use case that I keep mentioning, we've got this dynamic logo and rank function. So in this case, if I run this report, we'll see that same parameter prompt. We are using the dynamic logo here. We're going to see Exago display in the upper left because that was my company ID value. And in this case, we're using the rank function to actually rate our employees. If we expand any one of these groupings, we'll see that we've rated their service on every transaction, on every order that they were responsible for. Hopefully this helps get the wheels turning in how you guys might use this in your own environment, your own practical applications. Now on the design, I'd just like to point out that in this case, I have also used the function in different sections, a group header, as well as the detail section. Again, I fudged it a little, just like I said, of using the unit price data field here, but I felt that it was important just to illustrate how you might use a static value versus a data field and use it in different sections on your report. All right. So the last thing that I'm going to mention here, and I'm not going to walk through this one, but if you'd like to take this even further, on our support site, we have an article detailing how to use a custom function to reach out to an external API and dynamically display a different barcode. This function is significantly more complex than either of the two that we've walked through today, just due to the nature of what it is doing behind the scenes. But it's kind of taking everything that we've learned today, the building blocks, if you will, and building up upon them. I will link that article. It does have the code included. And I'll link it to the hosted version of this lab when I do post that following the lab today. Feel free to check it out, read through it, and of course reach out if you've got any questions on today's lab or anything else. We're happy to help. So I'm going to reiterate one last time, and of course check the questions pane really quick before I leave, though I know my team has been following along and helping us all out here. Just want to leave you guys with the next lab date. On the 24th, Travis is going to be walking through those configuration changes that are coming in our next major release of Exago. And as always, please let us know how we did today and what topics you might like to see coming up in the survey following, and of course on the registration form. So we'll hang around for questions for just a moment, but thank you guys so much for attending. We really appreciate it. We love bringing you new content every month, twice a month. These are really fun for us. We hope they're fun for you as well. So happy reporting and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.